Hi, welcome back. So in this video, this is going to be talking about the last feature with using colors, and it's a little bit hard to grasp at first, but once you start using it, you can really get used to it. So we're going to be working with gradients in this video, and for now I'm just going to go ahead and erase this background, and I'm just going to have a single color. So I'm just going to say steel blue, and I'm going to also erase this color property. So now we have a background of the steel blue color. There we go. So now it's working. So pretty much, if you don't know what a gradient is already, it's kind of a transition between two colors. So it's not just a sharp red to blue in one go. It smoothly moves or diffuses through the colors. So for example, you start just completely red, and then you move up, along, and as you go up, it gets more and more blue. So you're sort of mixing between the two colors. So if you've ever done any painting before or used maybe coloring pencils, if you kind of use paint and draw between the two colors, depending on the proportions between them, it's going to make sort of a purplish, and then it transitions like that. So pretty much that's what's going on here with our gradients, is we're transitioning between two colors. Now, of course, you can do more than two. You can put 3, 4, you can put as many colors as you want. But pretty much what you have to take away from this is that a gradient is just a transition between a number of colors. Okay, so now that we know what a gradient is, let's go ahead and get started adding them. So there are actually two types of gradients, radial and linear. So radial gradients are circular. They kind of move outwards from a center, and depending on the percentages or how much you want of each color, it's going to change the way the gradient looks. A linear gradient, on the other hand, is the one that I described earlier, a smooth red transition to blue. It could go from left to right, top to bottom, and even diagonally, depending on how we define the direction later in this video when we start creating our gradients. Alright, let's get started. So the first thing I want to work with is linear gradients. So the way to do this, just with our RGBA or our URL, all we have to do is type linear dash gradient, just like that. And from here, we can start defining our directions. So if you don't already know about directions already, pretty much there are 4 different positions: top, bottom, left, and right. And you can also combine the two to create corners. So for example, top right would be the top right corner. So first of all, what you're going to want to do is type 2, and then you're going to say the name of the direction. So in this case, I'm just going to say to right. So what this is going to be saying is you want the gradient to move to the right side. So it's going to be going this way. Now, there's also another way to do this I'll talk about in just a second, but for now, let's leave it like this. And then after your comma, you're going to add as many colors as you want. So in this case, I'm going to add red and blue. And remember to separate them also by a comma. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what's happening. You can see that we have a red slowly transitioning into a blue to the right side. So remember, it starts with the first color and moves on. Let's go ahead and add a green in there, and then a steel blue, and then a blue. Now we have 4 colors that are slowly transitioning. We have a red that slowly transitions into a green, and then a steel blue, you can sort of see it there, and then a blue. And just saying, we don't actually have to use these name colors. I just wanted to use them because it was quite easy to look at. So what we can actually do, and here's your first use for opacity, is you can go ahead and let's just take a random color here. So to right, remember this is starting here. We're going to paste in that color, but then we're going to finish it with an RGBA color, like that. And pretty much what's going to happen is this is going to be a slowly fading out color, just like this. So you can see what's happening is we start with a fully functional color, which has a has no transparency at all, and we slowly make it fade more and more out until we can't see the picture at all, or the color in this case. So yeah, that's pretty much a great way of looking at it, and that's pretty much it for linear gradients. Let's talk about actually making diagonal gradients now. So we know that we can have to right, we can also have to top, for example, if you wanted to start from the bottom, just like that, and you can see now it goes up. But what if we wanted to make it diagonal? So let's say we wanted to finish in the bottom right corner. What you would do is just type it out like this, to bottom right. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that it slowly goes down and fades out just at the bottom right. So there we go. that's pretty much it for positioning. But there's actually another way to do this, and it's through angles. So if you don't already know how to use angles, then you can pretty much skip this step because it's quite hard to get the use of it. But once you learn how to actually work with angles and you know how to move them around, things like that, it becomes very easy to work with them. So let's say you wanted them to go in a very specific direction. So for example, you wanted it to end somewhere here. Now obviously you can't use words for positioning because they only work at certain places, such as the corners. So if you wanted to do this, you're going to have to go ahead and use angles. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and erase this part because we're not using positioning, and then we're going to go ahead and type our angle. So the first thing I'm going to do is define the place that I want it to end. So let's say this time I wanted it to end on the left here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say minus 90, because remember what's happening here is we want it to just flip completely around. So let's say this is our starting angle, it's 0, and we go all the way down, minus 90. So if you don't already know, 90 is kind of a quarter turn. And what's going to happen is from here, we can type DEG, or degrees, and this is going to set the angle that we want it at. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. You can see that now it goes from right to left. Now, this is a pretty bad example considering we can just do this normally by typing to left. But why don't we go ahead and choose something a little bit more specific? So I'm going to go 146 degrees. So just remember that pointing upwards is kind of the starting position. And then we turn 90 degrees and then just a little bit over halfway. And I think that's not a very good example, so I'm going to go with 160. Now you can see once I refresh the page that it ends sort of around the corner, but not exactly on. And if I actually go ahead and add something like maybe 215, something like that, go ahead and refresh, you can see that they are ending in different places. It's a lot more specific. Now, it's not very obvious with this kind of fading color, but what's happening here is we can directly control where we want our gradient to end. So that's one way of using linear gradients. Now let's go ahead and talk about the next type of gradient, which are radial gradients. So first of all, I'm just going to erase this whole thing here because I don't really need it. Now, radial gradients don't work in the same way that linear ones do. Instead of having a specified direction, so for example, you want to go from right to left or from top to bottom, instead what happens is we can actually define the percentages or proportions of each color that we want. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually this background size. So one thing you need to note is that you cannot specify the cover background size or anything like that for these radial gradients because they just won't work. So what we're going to have to do is go ahead and remove this. There we go. Now let's go ahead and add our radial gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and type radial dash gradient, just like that. And now what we can do is specify a certain amount of colors. So for example, I'm just going to start out with red and blue. Now if we refresh the page, you can see it starts off red and ends at blue. But we can actually add more than two colors. Just like with our linear gradient there, what we can actually do is go ahead and type in, let's just say green. That's an example. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that we've added a third color. Now if we wanted to change the proportions, so for example, let's pretend that this blue is taking up too much space. We don't want that much. We can actually specify how much we want of each. So to change the proportions, what we can do is go ahead and add percentages. So what I'm going to do first is go and specify what I want here. Now, one thing to note is that these have to be in order. You have to have the minimum percentage or the smallest percentage at the start and then the largest at the finish. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with something small, like 20%. Then I'm going to have, let's say, 40% blue and 55% green. So now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that there is a lot more green and a lot less blue and red. So the final thing I want to cover for radial gradients is the shape. Now you can actually specify the shape that you want. Now right now I have an ellipse or sort of oval shape, but we can actually change it. All we have to do is type the name of the shape. Now there are two values you can put here, ellipse, which is the default, and circle. I'm going to go ahead and type circle. Now if I go ahead and refresh, you can see that this is in a much more circular shape rather than the previous oval. And although it's not a perfect circle, obviously our proportions are going to change what it looks like. Alright, so that's pretty much it for gradients. There's quite a lot to learn about these, and there's a lot more features that you can cover. But for now, I think this is great. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and just create another gradient, another linear gradient right under this one, just so you can see what it looks like. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and maybe let's just go for the body background for now. I'm going to go ahead and actually add a linear gradient here. And I'm going to say, let's just say to bottom, because again, we want it to kind of stretch from top to bottom. So now what we're going to do is start off very strong. So we're going to have our main RGBA color, or our main color here. So I'm going to copy this. So this is going to be a fully visible color, starting from the top, and then we're going to end with a much less visible color. So there you go. Now let's go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see that maybe there's a little bit of an error there. Oh, yep, forgot to spell it. There we go. Now we can go ahead and refresh, and you can see it's still not working. Still a bunch of errors here probably. Yep, forgot the parentheses there. Just make sure that you're doing this right, because sometimes you can make some silly errors. So for example, if you look here, we were missing a bracket. So now if we go ahead and refresh, there we go. It's a lot better now. So we start off with a nice fully visible color, and we end off with a less visible color. Alright, so there we go. That's pretty much it for gradients. You can go ahead and download this file from the project. You can go ahead and look at how everything works here, mess around with it, see what you can do, because there is a lot to gradients, and although they're not used every day, they're still very useful tools, and they can really help you out in your web development careers. Alright, let's move on.